Kodak Retina I, type 010, post-war camera. They were brought back to the States in large numbers by returning servicemen coming back from Germany, so there's a lot of them about in the States. This one, what was the story with this one? It didn't want to open. There was a problem with the door, and it was sent to me with the door wide open at the front. So the first thing I noticed was that the focus scale hadn't been returned to the infinity position, because obviously that would block that. If you go to close this, the cocking lever is sticking out the side of the shutter. So that's obviously been catching on the body, because if I look at that I see that's quite bent, and it's bent in a way that it was caught on the body and then the door opened. So it's been pulled backwards. So the cocking lever on the shutter is sticking. What's going on there? I'm not 100% sure about that. Certainly that's bent, and certainly it's sticking. When it's back in the closed position there, not a problem at all. When it's cocked, it seems to be catching on the bodywork there, just as it goes in, catches on the door catch. So something is not quite right with that, and it'll need to be attended to. As for the rest of the camera, well, it's tired. You can see it's got a few Zeiss bumps there. Hopefully I can see the back of that, and the leather on the door is a little bit fragmented. I think I'll need to remove that and re-glue it, and hopefully this can go back to its owner. It's a treasured family heirloom and needs to be in good working order. I'll start by removing the lens and shutter assembly, and the tool for this job is something like this. This was a Belgian tool. You can't get them on eBay anymore. You could once upon a time. It's very handy. You've got to engage the notches on that retaining ring down around the rear lens group, and it's down inside the moulding of the focus mount, so it's quite buried in there. Now I can feel the shutter rotating as I attempt to undo this ring. It's come loose now. The shutters were never keyed to the body. They really rely on friction to keep them in place, which wouldn't be an issue if they didn't have the extra shutter speed. The Compur Rapids have the 500th of a second speed, and the 500th of a second speed requires an extra spring to be engaged in order to provide that impetus, and you have to provide the force to set that, of course, and that's done by, that means that you've got to apply extra force on here, and as soon as you're applying extra force on the setting lever, you're effectively twisting the lens and the mount. So if it's not firmly in place, it'll twist, it'll rotate, and it'll end up in the wrong place. I could see that lever there was just falling back when it felt like it. Okay, so I've got to remove my screw here that couples the release to the shutter. The lens here is a Kodak Anastigmat Ectar. It doesn't appear to be coated, and it's very dull looking. I don't know whether that's just surface grime. I would hope so, because there's not much I can do about that. So I remove that screw. That's quite a long screw, so be very careful not to lose it or break it. Here's our shutter assembly out of the body. Here's the retaining ring. The rear group, now here, this is interesting, the surround for the rear group here, there's a scratch, quite a pronounced scratch across that mount, which suggests that somebody was in there at some stage with a tool and slipped. It doesn't appear to have scarred the glass, That's like, oh, that rear lens group was loose there. It should only be finger tight, but it wasn't really finger tight. I'll take that off. The front group, yeah, that's finger tight, and that was a little bit tougher to get off. Sometimes you'll need a friction tool to get something like that off. I've even made a clamp somewhere that will clamp onto that lens and remove it if it's a problem. The shutter itself, well, I'll just remove this screw here from the release so that we haven't got this arm flapping around catching on things while I'm trying to work. And here we can certainly see that bent arm, on the cocking lever for the shutter. I'll remove the front plate. So to get at the lock for this, I need to remove this nameplate first. And I'll remove it entirely today. Sometimes I'll just swing it out of the way. But this stuff's pretty grimy, so I want everything apart so I can clean it comfortably. And that little lock screw needs to be rotated. Well, it might rotate nicely with the tip of a pair of tweezers. It is today. It doesn't always. I've got a screwdriver that's made to do that job. But the tweezers will do it if it's not too terrible. Rotate this anti-clockwise. It's bayoneted on, and that should come off. Here we go. So there's our front plate. And you can see that grease on there, that yellow stuff, that's grease. It's sticky and that would cause problems. I'll unhook the spring from the main lever and lift the main lever out of the shutter. This part's called the main lever. It's probably the last thing in the world that you'd be looking for if someone said you to go and get the lever, but this is the lever. That button's going to need to be trued up somehow. It's obviously rubbing on the case. And we'll have a look at the rest of the shutter and see what's going on here. It's quite sticky. It doesn't want to return. It doesn't want to open and certainly doesn't want to close. So the shutter blades are clearly oily. They don't appear too bad, but there's certainly oil visible there. So it's either the shutter blades are tending to stick together, or the blade actuating ring, the ring that swings the blades open and shut, is gummy. That it's been, whatever grease or lubricant that was used on it has gone hard over time, and as a result it doesn't move freely anymore. So to dismantle things, I think our shutter release button will come off. It does. We should be able to get this lever out. It's got a spring tucked to it down inside the case here, which will hopefully pop out for me without too much of a fight. Yeah, it runs in a groove in the side of the case there, so sometimes it's hard to get it out. Okay, there we go. That's our main return spring for our shutter release, as it happens. This little spring here is something else again. We'll just hook that back where it came from. That's for this. This is the B lever. That's the return spring for the B lever. This little piece here is the latch that holds the shutter cocked. It's held by a single screw, and in this case its return spring is long and heads out over that way towards the retard gear train. This is a shoulder screw here holding this B lever in position. One of the things about that shoulder screw is that when you go to put it back together, you have to be careful not to over tighten it, because if you over tighten it, what happens is that the shoulder on the screw bites into the soft aluminium of the mechanism plate and effectively closes up the gap so that the lever doesn't swing freely anymore. This spring here is the 500th of a second speed spring, or high speed spring for the shutter. That's about all we need to take off from this side. At the back of the shutter there are 3 screws, and they hold the case and the mechanism plate together. These 3 screws are identical, so you don't need to know where they came from. Lift the case off. There's our mechanism plate with the shutter blades on it, and the shutter blades there certainly do look like they've got some oil on them. You see it around the edges where the blades overlap. Here's the case with the diaphragm blades in it, and that's a bit reluctant to move. The blades look oily and this doesn't want to move, so I'll dismantle this. You don't want to be forcing the lever on a diaphragm like this if the blades look like they're reluctant to move, because you could end up damaging something. It's got to come apart for servicing anyway. So the shutter blades, we've got 5 shutter blades of course. Just looking to see if there's anything odd about the way it's been done. No, everything's been put in the correct order as far as I can see. And the blade's quite clearly oily. Yeah, they're sticking together, coming out as a group probably. The blade actuating ring, how does that behave with no shutter blades on it? That's quite snappy in its action. Probably not as free as it might be, but it would certainly work. So our problem with the stiff shutter there is most certainly down to the sticky shutter blades, not something else. So that's always good to know. I'll unhook the spring from this lever. This is the lever at the top of the shutter that moves the blade actuating ring. Underneath there are 3 screws here, hold this retainer plate to the shutter. Now they may be different lengths, so you need to note where they came from if they're different lengths. I know that this will be the longest screw over here at that end of the speed train. I don't know whether this one will be a short screw as well. So I've got a short screw there and there, and I expect a longer screw over here. And I wasn't disappointed. Here's our retainer plate. That's quite gummy looking there with old oil and stuff. This has a rivet on it so that it locates firmly onto the mechanism plate. You can't put it in the wrong place. There's quite a bit of oil visible on the surfaces there, or grease more likely. And here's the blade actuating ring. This is a piece that swings backwards and forwards to open and close the shutter blades. Well, that's the mechanism plate pretty much stripped down. We'll have a look at the retard gear train. I'll hold back the pallets, that's at this end, and swing the arm backwards and forwards. That moves freely enough, but it's not as free as it should be, but it would function. So there's no serious problem with the retard gear train. All of this I'm going to swab very carefully with some naphtha on a cotton bud. And the retard gear train, I will flood that and work it repeatedly with naphtha and blow out that naphtha to carry away any oil or other contaminants. Typically I don't remove this from the mechanism plate in order to clean it, unless it's really gummed up. And that's because as soon as you disturb this, there's an adjustment at this end, there's an adjustment at that end. Getting the two of them correct so that the shutter works and the timing works smoothly and is fairly accurate is a real trial. So there's no point in looking for hard work. If the speed train's working quite well, you can flush it in place with naphtha and move on. Right, so much for the mechanism plate. Now what about this? So here I can't remove the setting lever from inside as you can with later shutters. So I'll just remove the 3 screws that hold the plate in place, the retainer. Tip that lot out. So there's our retainer plate. Here's our diaphragm blades. Now they came out as a rosette, but that would happen even if they were clean blades. If they're closed up, they're just interleaved and they'll come out as a rosette. That doesn't look too bad. I dropped that on the bench, they scattered, so that means they weren't glued together particularly badly. And here we've got our setting lever and the moving plate. Now this is stiff. I can tell from the feel of this that the stiffness I was feeling with the aperture settings was here, not with the blades. So there are 2 screws, I'll remove those. This is probably down to dried grease in behind that setting lever, but I don't know that until I've got this to bits and had a look. That looks reasonably clean. But the setting lever, that's covered in dried grease and looks like dust or dirt that's got in there. So that was friction on the back of the case there that I was feeling rather than anything on the inside of the shutter. So that gives me a shutter in little pieces. And all of this will need to be cleaned and reassembled. And of course I've got to deal with the state of this arm here. To find out why that was binding on the camera case, what I suspect is it was catching on the door catch down in here, which we may or may not be able to easily see. No, you can't see. Yeah, you can just glimpse it down in here, that little bright thing. That's the catch that opens the door, and I suspect that was little arm was catching on there. However, more work will be required. So this shutter I'll start cleaning. Well, as I clean this part, the setting lever, you can see how much grime comes off that, and that's dried grease and dust that's coming off there, and that would account for that high friction. What tends to happen with grease over time is it loses all its volatile components, which probably rush away as quickly as they can to contaminate the shutter blades, and you're left with a sticky, waxy base, and whatever else had been in was in the grease to give it some body. I think they call that the soap. But certainly that's what tends to happen. The volatile components go and you're left with a sticky, waxy base. Right, well that's a lot cleaner. So I expect that'll move nicely on the body now. And I'm looking at the state of this. It looks a bit oily. you can tell when you clean something like this, it goes from a dark colour, a dark shiny colour, to a dull colour, light colour. Then that means that you've probably moved oil off it and you're looking at the nice clean metal again. Now I can see by the colour coming off here on the cotton bud that there's a fair bit of contamination there. You can tell by the pattern on this that it's sat in one position for a long time. Well, given that the camera was made pretty much immediately post World War II, it's probably had a long time to sit idle in cupboards somewhere before it got to my repair bench. And I'll give that one more round of cleaning. I'm just going to give this a wipe with some molybdenum paste. And you need very little of this. You just sort of leave a dirty mark on the surfaces, that's more than enough. You can see I rubbed around the inside edge there so I can be sure that it's going to run smoothly around the case there. I'm just checking the feel of this on the case. It moves freely. I think that's probably going to be quite good. This only goes one way up because the holes are countersunk where the screw heads sit. So look closely at that. And I'll get these screws in. I'm supporting the lever with my fingers from underneath, holding it against the case. Just having fun getting that screw started. And I'll do the other one. Now I'm going to support this on the edge of a wooden block so that the lever is supported underneath while I do the screw up. They should be snug, but don't over tighten them because you'll end up stripping them out of the lever. It's not uncommon, and either the screw or the threads in the lever go. Now that's probably a bit loose. That's very free running now. That's probably freer than I would like it to be. You need some control here, some controlled friction, otherwise when you set the aperture it's too easily knocked. It's too easy to knock the setting when you're cocking the shutter. So I'll show you what I'll do about that. So I'll remove those two screws. And this lever, I'll bend that slightly so that it has some tension against the case, and that'll provide some controlled friction. Just find some pliers. Okay. It's not dead flat as it stands. It's obviously had some tension there before. It certainly doesn't have any at the moment. It's easy to overdo this. I just want to distort this slightly so it presses against the case. Let's see if I can get that screw in there and see how this behaves. Pushing away there, I'm not getting that screwed in correctly. That's better. Let's mate on the other side. I'll check the feel of that. Yeah, that's much better. It moves smoothly, but it's not. It won't just drift. It has enough resistance that it'll stay where it's put, which is what we're wanting.